Have you ever stood in a place you visited as a child and felt the specific, disorienting vertigo of recognizing a location while being unable to recognize the world it exists within? The building is the same. The street is the same. The basic geography of the place is unchanged, but everything surrounding it, everything that gave it its context and its meaning and its relationship to the rest of your life, has transformed so thoroughly that the familiarity of the physical space only makes the unfamiliarity of everything else more acute. That the thing that has remained constant, by remaining constant while everything around it changed, has itself become strange. This experience, which most people have had in some form, is a small and personal version of something that is about to happen at civilizational scale. Something that will not be experienced in a single moment of return to a childhood location, but will unfold continuously, accelerating across every domain of human life simultaneously, until the people who are alive in 2030 look back at the world of 2025 with the same bewildered recognition that a person who left a country for a decade experiences when they return to find that the language is the same and the faces are broadly familiar, but the entire context within which those familiar elements existed has been replaced by something they have no framework for understanding. I want to be precise about what I am claiming, because the claim that the world will be unrecognizable by 2030 is a claim that deserves precision rather than vagueness, that deserves the discipline of specific argument rather than the comfortable gesture toward general disruption that passes for analysis in most discussions of technological change. I am not claiming that the world of 2030 will be unrecognizable in the sense that everything will be different, that the physical landscape of cities and towns will be transformed beyond identification, that the basic biological and social nature of human beings will have been altered beyond recognition. Those kinds of total transformation are not what is coming by 2030. What I am claiming is something more specific and more immediately consequential. I am claiming that the specific framework through which human beings in 2025 understand their relationship to work, to knowledge, to political authority, to other human beings, to their own identity, to reality itself, will by 2030 have been so thoroughly disrupted that the assumptions underlying that framework will no longer be recognizable as the default assumptions of the world people inhabit. That the things which currently feel like the stable background of human life, the things so fundamental that they do not need to be examined because they are simply the way things are, will by 2030 have been exposed as contingent arrangements that were always more fragile and more historically specific than they appeared, and that their exposure will have produced a quality of collective disorientation that has no adequate historical precedent. And the reason I am making this claim specifically about 2030 rather than 2040 or 2050 or any other point further along the trajectory, the reason the 5-year horizon is the relevant one rather than a more comfortable distance, is not because I am trying to produce alarm for its own sake. It is because the specific convergence of technological, political, ecological, and social forces that is driving the transformation is not on a 50-year timeline. It is on a 5-year timeline. And the difference between understanding this accurately and continuing to process the transformation as something that will happen in the distant future, rather than something that is happening right now, and will reach a critical threshold within the span of a single presidential term, is the difference between having any meaningful capacity to shape the transition and being entirely subject to it. So let us begin where the transformation is already most advanced and most visible, and trace the specific mechanisms through which it is going to make the world of 2030 genuinely unrecognizable from the world of 2025. The first and most comprehensive transformation is the one that is reshaping the relationship between human intelligence and machine intelligence in ways that will, by 2030, have made the entire framework through which we currently understand human cognitive value essentially obsolete. The legal profession, which in 2025 is already experiencing the first waves of AI-driven disruption in document review, contract analysis, and legal research, will by 2030 be navigating a situation in which AI systems are performing the majority of the cognitive work currently done by junior and mid-level lawyers, in which the economic justification for large teams of human attorneys has been comprehensively undermined, and in which the legal profession is desperately trying to redefine what uniquely human legal expertise actually means, in a world where the specific skills that legal training has historically been designed to develop are increasingly indistinguishable from skills that AI systems can replicate and surpass. The financial sector, the media industry, the educational sector, the architectural profession, the field of software development itself will all be navigating versions of the same disruption, each at a different stage of advancement, but all pointing in the same direction and all arriving at recognizably similar versions of the same fundamental question. What are human beings for in a world where the cognitive tasks that have historically justified their economic value can be performed better by systems that require no salaries, no vacations, no training periods, no emotional management, no career development, and no existential reassurance? This question is going to be the defining question of 2030 in a way that makes it sound described in 2025 like hyperbole, but that will, experienced in 2030, feel like simply the obvious and inescapable reality of the world. In 2025, the dominant mental model that most people use to understand the relationship between human beings and artificial intelligence systems is still, despite all the evidence against it, a model of tools and users. In this model, AI systems are extraordinarily sophisticated tools, but tools nonetheless. Instruments that human beings deploy to perform specific tasks more efficiently, that extend and amplify human capability without replacing the human judgment and human creativity and human understanding that direct their use. In this model, the human being remains the agent, the AI system remains the instrument, and the question of what human beings are for, what makes human cognitive contribution uniquely valuable, what justifies the enormous social investment in human education and human expertise and human professional development, remains answerable in roughly the same terms that it has been answerable for the last several decades. By 2030, this mental model will have been shattered beyond reconstruction, not by philosophical argument or by the theoretical predictions of researchers, but by the accumulated weight of concrete, everyday, unavoidable experience across every domain of human cognitive activity simultaneously. The shattering will not happen in a single dramatic moment. It will happen through the accumulation of thousands of specific encounters, in specific professional contexts, in specific daily activities, in specific moments of trying to explain why a human being is better suited to perform a particular cognitive task than an AI system that is demonstrably performing the same task faster, more consistently, more comprehensively, and at a fraction of the cost. Consider what the professional landscape is actually going to look like in 2030. Based on trajectories that are already visible and already measurable in 2025. The medical profession, which in 2025 is experiencing AI disruption primarily in diagnostic imaging and specific diagnostic tasks, will by 2030 be facing the much more comprehensive disruption of AI systems that integrate genomic data, real-time physiological monitoring, complete medical history, the entire published literature of medicine, and pattern recognition across billions of patient cases to produce diagnostic and treatment recommendations that exceed the capability of any individual physician working from their own training and experience. The question of what a doctor is for, what the specific value of human medical judgment is in a world where AI medical judgment is demonstrably more accurate and more comprehensive, will by 2030 be not a theoretical question about the future, but an urgent, practical question being negotiated in hospitals and insurance systems and regulatory bodies and medical schools simultaneously. And the specific way in which it reshapes the landscape of human life, the institutions, the social hierarchies, the educational systems, the economic arrangements, the political conflicts, the psychological experience of daily existence, will make the world of 2030 genuinely unrecognizable from the perspective of the frameworks through which the world of 2025 is currently understood. The second transformation, operating in parallel with the first and interacting with it in ways that multiply both transformations' effects, is the transformation of the information environment from something that, however imperfect and however distorted by commercial and political interests, shared enough common ground to constitute a single shared reality that different people inhabited, to something that is fragmenting into mutually incompatible informational universes that share a physical world while inhabiting entirely different factual ones. In 2025, the fragmentation of shared reality is already visible and already alarming to anyone paying careful attention to it, but it is still, for the most part, a fragmentation that operates within recognizable limits. People on different ends of the political spectrum in most societies are working from different selections of facts and different interpretations of shared events, but they are still, broadly speaking, aware that the other interpretation exists and that the people holding it are operating in response to something recognizable as a version of the same world. The disagreements are about interpretation and emphasis and value more than about the basic structure of reality itself. By 2030, this will have changed in ways that make the information environment of 2025 look almost quaintly unified by comparison. The specific technologies that are going to drive this change are already in development and in some cases already deployed in 2025. Generative AI systems of increasing sophistication are already capable of producing text, images, audio, and video content that is indistinguishable from human-produced content, and that can be produced at scale, at speed, and at essentially zero marginal cost. By 2030, these systems will be capable of producing entire informational ecosystems, complete synthetic media environments tailored to the specific psychological profiles of specific audiences, in which every news story, every documentary, every expert interview, every historical document, every piece of evidence can be generated, altered, or fabricated with a fidelity and a comprehensiveness that will make the distinction between authentic and synthetic content essentially impossible to maintain through any means available to ordinary users of these systems. The political and social consequences of this are not difficult to predict, because the consequences of much cruder versions of the same technology, specifically the deepfake videos and synthetic text of the early 2020s, have already been extensively studied and documented. When the cost of producing convincing false information approaches zero and the cost of verifying authentic information remains high, the information environment tilts decisively toward the producers of false information, who benefit from its production, and away from the consumers of information, who lack the tools to distinguish authentic from synthetic content. The result, already visible in its early stages in 2025, will by 2030 have advanced to a point where the concept of a shared evidentiary basis for public argument, the concept that underlies every model of democratic deliberation and collective decision-making, will have been so thoroughly undermined that describing it as merely fragmented will be a significant understatement. What this means for how people understand the world in 2030 is genuinely difficult to fully anticipate, because it represents a kind of disruption to the basic epistemological conditions of public life that has no historical precedent. Previous societies have experienced propaganda, have experienced the manipulation of information for political purposes, have experienced the deliberate distortion of reality by powerful actors with the means and the motivation to shape public perception. But all previous experiences of information manipulation operated within a world in which authentic information existed and could, however imperfectly and however costly, be distinguished from inauthentic information. By 2030, the technological capacity to produce synthetic information that is indistinguishable from authentic information at scale will have fundamentally altered this condition, producing a world in which the question of what is real and what is fabricated will not be answerable in any individual case with confidence, and in which the political and social consequences of this unanswerable quality will be rippling through every institution and every relationship and every form of collective life. The third transformation is the political one, and it is perhaps the most immediately consequential for the daily lives of the largest number of people. The political landscape of 2030 is going to look recognizably continuous with the political landscape of 2025 in its surface features, its institutions, its formal procedures, its constitutional arrangements, but unrecognizable in the actual distribution of power and the actual mechanisms through which consequential decisions are made and enforced. The surface continuity will be real. Most of the democratic institutions that exist in 2025 will still formally exist in 2030. Elections will still be held, legislatures will still meet, courts will still issue rulings, the formal vocabulary of democratic governance will still be widely employed. But the specific relationship between these formal institutions and the actual exercise of power, the question of whether these institutions are actually constraining and directing the behavior of the most powerful actors in the global system, or whether they are increasingly theatrical frameworks within which the actual exercise of power by those actors proceeds largely unconstrained, will by 2030 have shifted so decisively in the direction of the latter that the gap between the formal description and the functional reality of democratic governance will be impossible to ignore by anyone paying honest attention to it. The specific mechanisms driving this shift are already operating in 2025 and are all accelerating rather than decelerating. The concentration of economic power in a small number of entities, corporations, and individuals and sovereign wealth funds, whose resources dwarf those of most democratic states, and whose capacity to shape regulatory environments, media narratives, and political processes through those resources exceeds the capacity of most formal democratic mechanisms to meaningfully constrain. The development of AI systems that are going to allow those already highly concentrated forms of power to be exercised with a precision, a comprehensiveness, and an invisibility that makes the political influence of wealthy interests in the early 21st century look crude and limited by comparison. The erosion of the shared informational environment that democratic deliberation requires. The growing and justified perception across most wealthy democracies and most developing societies that the formal institutions of democratic governance are not actually delivering the outcomes they promise and cannot be made to do so within their current frameworks. By 2030, the political landscape will be one in which these forces have advanced far enough that the conversation about democratic governance will have shifted in ways that will be uncomfortable for anyone committed to the values that democratic governance is supposed to embody. From a conversation about how to make existing democratic institutions more effective to a conversation about whether existing democratic institutions are salvageable in any form that retains genuine meaning. The fourth transformation is the ecological one, and it is the one that is, in several respects, the most certain in its trajectory and the most consequential in its ultimate implications, and yet the one that is, for reasons we have discussed in previous conversations, the most systematically underweighted in how most people think about what 2030 will look like. The physical world of 2030 is going to be measurably, consequentially different from the physical world of 2025 in ways that will be impossible for even the most determined avoiders of ecological reality to ignore. The specific manifestations of climate change that will be most immediately visible in 2030, the increased frequency and severity of extreme weather events, the accelerating disruption of agricultural systems in regions that have historically been the world's most productive, the displacement of populations from coastal and low-lying areas and from regions rendered agriculturally or habitationally non-viable by heat and drought. The cascading effects of these disruptions on global supply chains and food systems and political stability will collectively constitute a physical environment that is not apocalyptically different from the physical environment of 2025, but that is sufficiently different to have altered in ways that will be impossible to reverse on any politically relevant timescale. the basic conditions within which human civilization is operating. The political consequences of ecological disruption by 2030 will be at least as significant as the physical consequences, because the political systems of 2030 will be navigating not only the direct effects of climate change, but the dramatically amplified political instability, the migration pressures, the resource conflicts, the failures of governance in the societies most directly affected that flow from those direct effects. The relationship between ecological disruption and political instability is not linear or simple, but it is real, and it is already visible in 2025 in the contribution of drought and agricultural failure and resource scarcity to the political conflicts and population displacements that are already among the defining features of the current geopolitical landscape. By 2030, this relationship will be more visible, more consequential, and more directly implicated in the political crises that will be dominating public attention. The fifth transformation is perhaps the most intimate and the most philosophically significant, and it is the one that I want to spend the most time on, because it is the one that will most directly shape the daily experience of being a human being in 2030, rather than simply the institutional and structural context within which that experience occurs. It is the transformation of human identity itself, of the specific self-understanding through which people in 2025 organize their sense of who they are, what they are capable of, what makes them distinctively and irreplaceably valuable as individual human beings, and what gives their existence its felt sense of significance and purpose. The relationship between human identity and the specific capabilities that AI systems are going to demonstrate by 2030 is going to be one of the most psychologically consequential features of the new world, because human identity in the modern era has been built, to a degree that is rarely fully acknowledged, on the implicit assumption of human cognitive supremacy. The specific ways in which people understand themselves, the specific sources of pride and self-worth and felt significance that organize daily experience are built around the assumption that human intelligence, human creativity, human judgment, and human understanding represent something genuinely superior to anything that non-human systems can produce. This assumption is so fundamental, so thoroughly woven into the fabric of how modern people understand themselves and their place in the world, that most people are not consciously aware of holding it. It is not a belief they have examined and affirmed, it is simply the water they swim in, the unquestioned background against which every specific belief about their own value and capability is formed. By 2030, this assumption will have been publicly, demonstrably, and irreversibly refuted across virtually every domain of human cognitive activity. Not theoretically refuted, not refuted by the predictions of researchers or the arguments of philosophers, but refuted concretely and experientially by the daily reality of AI systems outperforming human beings at the specific tasks that those human beings have used as the foundation of their sense of their own distinctive value. The lawyer who discovers that an AI system can construct a more persuasive legal argument than they can will not be experiencing a theoretical disruption. They will be experiencing a direct, personal, intimate challenge to the specific self-understanding around which they have organized their entire professional identity. The doctor who discovers that an AI system is more reliably accurate in their diagnostic domain will not be processing an abstract economic threat. They will be experiencing a profound and disorienting challenge to the specific source of felt significance that years of medical training were supposed to produce. This experience will not be limited to professionals. It will extend in different forms and with different specific content to virtually every person in any society integrated into the digital economy, because the assumption of human cognitive supremacy is not only a feature of professional identity, it is a feature of everyday human self-understanding. The sense that your thoughts, your opinions, your interpretations, your creative responses to the world are genuinely yours in a way that makes them distinctively valuable, rather than simply one more instance of a pattern that a sufficiently sophisticated AI system could generate more elegantly and more comprehensively without the specific biographical and neurological history that produced yours. The psychological consequences of this challenge to the assumption of human cognitive supremacy will vary enormously depending on the specific frameworks that individuals have available for making sense of their own value in a world where cognitive supremacy is no longer a reliable foundation for it. People who have built their sense of self entirely on professional accomplishment and cognitive capability will experience the most acute disruption. People who have developed through deliberate cultivation or through fortunate circumstance, sources of felt significance that do not depend on cognitive supremacy, sources rooted in genuine relationship, in craft and care and presence, in the specific irreplaceable texture of a particular human life in all its vulnerability and its finitude, will be in a significantly better position. But even for them, the world of 2030 will require a renegotiation of identity whose difficulty and whose stakes should not be underestimated. This renegotiation is already beginning in small and largely invisible ways in 2025. It is visible in the conversations people are having, often with significant discomfort and significant resistance, about what education is for in a world where the specific knowledge and skills that education has historically been designed to transmit are becoming increasingly replicable by AI systems. It is visible in the growing uncertainty about what careers are worth building and what professional identities are worth investing in, an uncertainty that the vocational guidance industry and the educational establishment are almost entirely unprepared to address honestly. It is visible in the specific quality of anxiety that many people who are paying attention to the trajectory of AI development are experiencing. An anxiety that is not simply about economic security, but about something deeper and more fundamental, about whether the specific human life they are living and the specific human self they have built is going to remain legible as something genuinely valuable in the world that is taking shape around them. By 2030, this renegotiation will not be happening in the margins of public consciousness. It will be the central, defining, unavoidable psychological and cultural challenge of the era, and the frameworks that individuals and communities develop for navigating it will determine, more than any specific policy or any specific technology, the quality of human experience that the world of 2030 actually produces. Now, I want to address directly the objection that the most careful and most thoughtful readers will already be forming. The objection that predictions about transformative disruption within specific short time horizons have a long and not entirely distinguished history, that the specific year named as the threshold of unrecognizability has been moved repeatedly as the predicted transformations failed to arrive on schedule, that the genuine uncertainties in the trajectory of AI development and ecological change and political transformation make any specific prediction about what 2030 will look like more speculative than it sounds when stated with the confidence that the preceding analysis has employed. This objection deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed, because it is right about the history of technological prediction and right about the genuine uncertainties in the current trajectory. The specific form that the transformations I have been describing will take in 2030 is genuinely uncertain in ways that the confidence of this analysis might obscure. The pace of AI development has been faster than most predictions in recent years, but it has also encountered genuine obstacles and genuine limitations that have slowed specific applications relative to early projections. The political transformations underway are real, but are also subject to resistance, to counter-movements, to the genuine capacity of human institutions to adapt to pressures they would otherwise succumb to. The ecological trajectory is certain in its direction, but uncertain in its pace and in the specific ways its consequences will manifest in different regions and different social contexts. All of this is true. And yet the objection, while it deserves to be acknowledged, does not ultimately undermine the central claim. Because the central claim is not that any specific technology will have achieved any specific threshold of capability by 2030. It is that the convergence of multiple simultaneous transformations, each individually significant and collectively unprecedented, will by 2030 have produced a world that is genuinely unrecognizable from the frameworks through which the world of 2025 is understood, even if the specific form of that unrecognizability differs from what any specific prediction anticipated. The history of transformative technological and social change suggests that the transitions that end up being most consequential are rarely the ones that arrived exactly as predicted. They are the ones that arrived in approximately the right time frame, in approximately the right domains, with approximately the right magnitude of consequence, but in specific forms that no individual prediction fully captured. The internet did not transform human civilization in precisely the way that the predictions of the 1990s anticipated. But it transformed human civilization in a way that was, in its overall magnitude and its overall direction, recognizable as what those predictions were pointing toward. The same is true of every major technological transition in human history. The specific form is rarely predictable with precision. The general magnitude and direction of transformation is often more accurately anticipated than the specific failures of specific predictions suggest. What the world of 2030 will actually look like in its specific details is genuinely uncertain. What is much less uncertain is that it will look to anyone who is attempting to navigate it with the frameworks and the assumptions and the identity structures of 2025, genuinely and disconcertingly and in many respects fundamentally different. Not different in the way that 2025 looks different from 2015, a difference that is